The memory didn't feel like a memory at all. It was a wound, forever fresh and seeping, a splinter of ice lodged deep in Maya's soul. It began not with sight, but with smell, the sharp, acrid scent of fear sweat on her uncle's skin, overlaying the homely aroma of stewed rabbit and hearth smoke. 9 years old. The number was a brand. Her small hands, already calloused from chores, were clenched in the rough wool of her own tunic. She was hiding in the pantry, a dark, cramped space that was her sanctuary. The low, urgent rumble of a stranger's voice vibrated through the thin wooden door. A burden, you say, Hemet. But she's of age. She'll present soon. Could be a beta, could be nothing. A gamble. Her uncle's voice, usually slurred with ale, was sharp, wheedling. She's a quiet thing, scrawny, but she works. And look, a sliver of light cut across her face as the pantry door was wrenched open. She flinched back, her wide, pale blue eyes staring up at the two silhouettes. Her uncle, Hemet, with his bloated face and greasy hair, and a man she'd never seen tall, clad in dark leather, with a scent of cold metal and distant pine. The stranger's eyes, flat and black, scanned her. They felt like beetles crawling over her skin. Stand up, girl. Hemet yanked her out by the arm. Her heart was a frantic bird beating against her ribs. Don't cry, don't cry, don't cry, she chanted in her head. Tears made him angry. Show him your arms, Hemet commanded, his voice tight. Confused, trembling, Maya held out her thin arms. From wrist to shoulder, her skin was a canvas of deep indigo blue markings. They weren't like the ceremonial ink the village elders wore. These were born with her, a tapestry of swirling, interconnected lines that looked like ancient script or the veins of a frost-kissed leaf. She'd always had them. The other children called her the scribbled girl. The stranger grunted. He reached out a gloved hand and traced one of the patterns on her forearm. His touch was cold, impersonal, a shiver of profound revulsion, a feeling far too old for her 9 years, racked her small frame. Peculiar, the man murmured. A defect, most likely, or a curse. Lowers her value considerably. Hemet, I'm taking a risk. They're just marks. She's strong for her size. Her uncle argued, but the desperation was clear. He wanted her gone. She was the lingering shame of his dead sister, a mouth he didn't want to feed, a pair of eyes that judged his drunken failures. The stranger reached into a pouch at his belt. The sound was like a handful of tiny cold bells. He counted out 30 small, dull silver coins onto the rough-hewn table. 30 pieces. The number meant nothing to her then, but the finality of the clinking sound would haunt her forever. 30 silver, the man said. For the defective, unbonded child. Take it or leave it. Hemet's eyes gleamed with a greed that eclipsed any last shred of kinship. He scooped the coins into his palm. Done. Done. The word was a tombstone sealing her fate. No. The cry was torn from her, a raw, childish sound. She clutched at her uncle's tunic. Uncle, please, I'll work harder. He backhanded her across the face. The world exploded in a burst of white light and searing pain. She stumbled, falling hard against the packed earth floor, the taste of copper flooding her mouth. You belong to him now, girl, Hemet snarled, not looking at her. Don't cause trouble. The stranger, her new owner, didn't speak. He simply bent down, his movements efficient and devoid of emotion, and wrapped a heavy chain around her thin neck. The metal was shockingly cold, a brutal weight that promised only submission. He pulled her to her feet and led her out of the only home she'd ever known. She didn't look back at her uncle. She kept her eyes on the back of the man's leather-clad legs, the chain a short, cruel leash. They walked out of the village and into the dark, swallowing forest. The sounds of crickets and the rustle of unseen creatures became the soundtrack to her shattered life. The cold of the chain seeped into her bones, a chill that would never, ever leave her. She was 9 years old. She had been sold for 30 pieces of silver, and the intricate, mysterious tattoos on her skin, the ones the man had called a defect, seemed to pulse with a faint, answering cold, a secret buried deep within her very flesh, waiting. 15 years later, the cold was a familiar companion. It lived in the stone walls of the Greywater fortress, in the damp straw of her palate, and in the eyes of the alphas and betas who owned her. It was a part of her, as much as the white braids she meticulously wound each morning, and the pale blue eyes that had long since learned to hide their vulnerability behind a wall of frost. Maya moved through the scullery, a cavernous room steamy with the heat of boiling water and lye soap. Her hands, red and raw, scrubbed rhythmically at a seemingly endless pile of pots. The scent of old grease and harsh soap filled her nostrils, a far cry from the forest smells of her childhood. This was her world now. She was an omega, the lowest of the low, unbonded, worthless, and marked. Scrape, scrub, rinse. The mindless rhythm was a shield. If she kept her head down, if she made herself a ghost, they sometimes forgot to torment her. Sometimes, look at the scribble-skinned freak. A voice sneered from the doorway. Maya didn't need to look up. She knew the voice. Lyra, daughter of the fortress's alpha warden, and her two beta shadows, Rhea and Kale. Lyra, with her perfect chestnut curls and contemptuous brown eyes, whose favorite pastime was reminding Maya of her place. Does the dirt even stick to all those lines, Omega? Lyra sauntered closer, her fine silk skirts swishing against the grimy floor. Or do you have to scrub each little squiggle individually? Maya kept scrubbing, her shoulders tense. I asked you a question, mutt. Lyra's foot, clad in soft leather, kicked the bucket of scalding wash water. It tipped, sloshing burning liquid over Maya's legs and feet. A hiss of pain escaped Maya's lips before she could stop it. The heat was a sharp, bright agony against her skin, a stark contrast to the ever-present inner cold. She curled in on herself, clutching her scalded shins. The simple wool of her trousers stuck to her skin, already promising blisters. Lyra laughed, a sound like shattering glass. Clumsy thing. You should be more careful. Through a veil of pain tears, Maya watched them leave, their laughter echoing in the steamy room. The familiar, bitter rage boiled in her gut, hot and acidic. She imagined, for a fleeting, wild moment, lunging at Lyra, wrapping her hands around that perfect throat. And then what? The cold, practical part of her mind whispered. They'd kill you. Or worse, they'd break you completely. She uncurled, her jaw clenched so tight it ached. Pushing herself up, she limped towards the small high window that looked out over the main courtyard. She needed the cold, fresh air. She needed to see the sky. Leaning her forehead against the damp stone, she breathed deeply. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and turned earth from the distant woods beyond the fortress walls. Freedom. A concept as distant as the moon. Her eyes, however, were drawn not to the woods, but to the commotion in the courtyard below. Dozens of the warden's guards were forming ranks, polishing armor, shouting orders. Banners bearing the Greywater crest, a silver hawk, were being hung alongside new ones, flags of a deep, brutal black embroidered with a snarling, stylized wolf's head. Her blood went still in her veins. The wolf, the sigil of the Blood Moon Citadel, the king of alphas, Kalian, a name spoken only in whispers, a myth given flesh. It was said his power was so immense it was a physical pressure in the air, that his eyes could strip a soul bare, that he had torn the throne from his own father's chest in a challenge that had lasted 3 days and painted the citadel stones with gore. He was primal, powerful, and utterly merciless, and he was coming here, today. Panic, cold and sharp, joined the pain from her burns. The visit of such a figure meant chaos. It meant scrutiny. For an unbonded, marked Omega, it meant danger. She would have to be more invisible than ever. You, scullery rat. Maya jumped, turning to see the hulking form of Borvin, the head guardsman, filling the scullery doorway. His face was grim. The king's retinue arrives within the hour. We're short-handed in the great hall. You're to serve. Her heart plummeted. Me? But I'm the scullery. I don't care if you're the queen of the Fae herself, he snapped. You can carry a tray. You will be silent. You will keep your eyes on the floor. And for the god's sake, cover those arms. The sight of your markings might offend the king. He tossed a bundle of coarse gray fabric at her. A servant's tunic. Be in the hall in 10 minutes. Don't make me come find you. He left. Maya stood frozen, the rough cloth clutched in her trembling hands. Serve. In the great hall, where the Alpha King would be, where Lyra would be, preening and posturing. It was a nightmare. Her gaze dropped to her arms, to the indigo tattoos that coiled around her limbs like sleeping serpents. The sight might offend the king. A fresh wave of shame, hot and familiar, washed over her. She pulled the long-sleeved tunic over her head, hiding the markings that had defined her as other her entire life. The fabric was scratchy and smelled of dust, but it was a shield. As she hurried through the torchlit corridors towards the roaring noise of the great hall, the memory of the chain around her 9-year-old neck seemed to tighten. She was still leashed, just by different means. She slipped into the bustling chaos of the hall, a vast space with a vaulted ceiling lost in shadow. A massive fire roared in the hearth, and long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, spiced wines, and loaves of dark bread. The air was thick with the smells of food, smoke, and the potent, musky scent of powerful alphas. She took her place against the wall with the other lower servants, a flagon of wine held in her sweaty hands. Her task was simple. Move forward, fill cups, retreat. Don't be seen. The massive oak doors of the hall swung open with a crash that silenced the room, and he entered. Creed, the king. He was taller than any man she had ever seen, his shoulders impossibly broad, seeming to block out the very light from the doorway. He wore a dark, open vest over a bare, powerfully sculpted chest that was a map of old scars and corded muscle. His hair was a tousled, unruly mane of golden blonde, catching the firelight like a crown, but it was his face that held her captive, a strong, brutal jaw, a mouth set in a line of cool authority, and eyes. His eyes were a stormy, intense gray, and they swept over the hall with the lazy, predatory assessment of a wolf surveying its domain. The power rolling off him was a tangible force, a thrum in the air that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. Every instinct in her body screamed at once. Predator, run, hide. She forced her gaze down, focusing on the stone floor, her heart hammering against her ribs so violently she felt dizzy. She could feel his presence like a physical weight as he moved to the high table, the warden and his family bowing and scraping before him. Time became a blur of terror and forced motion. When her turn came, she moved forward on numb legs, her head bowed, the heavy wine flagon clutched tight. She moved along the high table, filling goblets without looking up. She could feel Lyra's gaze on her, sharp and malicious. She reached the king's goblet. It was a heavy, carved silver cup. Her hand trembled as she poured the dark red wine. She focused on the task, on not spilling a drop, on being a ghost. And then it happened. As she finished pouring and began to pull back, Lyra, sitting beside the king, accidentally jerked her elbow, knocking her own goblet over. The crimson wine splashed across the table, a few drops splattering the king's bare forearm. A collective, sharp intake of breath filled the hall. "You clumsy, worthless creature!" Lyra shrieked, her voice dripping with false outrage. Maya froze, her blood turning to ice. She looked up, her pale blue eyes wide with terror, and her gaze collided directly with the stormy gray eyes of the Alpha King. His gaze was like a physical blow. It was ancient, knowing, and utterly ruthless. It held her pinned, a butterfly on a spike. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The roaring in the hall faded to a distant hum. There was only him, and the terrifying, primal intensity of his stare. He didn't look at the spilled wine. He didn't look at Lyra. His eyes were locked on Maya. His nostrils flared slightly, as if scenting the air. And then, his deep, gravelly voice, a sound that vibrated deep in her bones, cut through the silence. "You!" The single word was a command, a question, and a verdict all in one. The flagon slipped from Maya's nerveless fingers and shattered on the floor at her feet, but the sound was lost in the deafening beat of her own heart. The predator had seen the prey, and he was not looking away. The world shrank to the space between his eyes and hers. The shattering of the clay flagon was a distant, muffled sound, like a stone dropped into deep water. The gasps, the muttered curses, Lyra's venomous glare, it all faded into a blur of meaningless noise and color. There was only the king. Creed. His gaze was a physical weight, pressing down on her, stripping away the thin veneer of her servitude, her forced anonymity. It felt like he was seeing past the coarse gray tunic, past the white braids she used as a curtain to hide behind, past the skin itself, down to the very core of her, to the splinter of ice that had lived in her soul since she was 9 years old. His stormy gray eyes held no anger about the spilled wine. Instead, they burned with a cold, incisive curiosity that was far more terrifying. Run. The primal instinct screamed through every nerve ending, but her feet were rooted to the stone floor, trapped in the puddle of wine and pottery shards. She was a rabbit caught in the open, frozen under the shadow of the hawk. "My king," the warden, Lyra's father, sputtered, his face pale with panic. "1,000 apologies. This Omega is a clumsy wretch from the scullery. She will be punished most severely." The word punished finally broke the spell of her paralysis. A fresh wave of terror, cold and sharp, washed over her. Punishment here could mean a public lashing, the stocks, or being thrown into the freezing cells beneath the fortress. Her breath hitched, a tiny, pathetic sound in the suffocating silence. Creed's eyes finally left hers, shifting slowly to the warden. The intensity of his focus lessened by a fraction, and Maya could finally drag air into her burning lungs. "An omega," Creed repeated, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. He said the word "not" with the usual contempt, but with a strange, considering tone, as if it were a piece of a puzzle. His gaze swept back to her, and this time, it felt different. It was no longer just a predator looking at prey. It was a hunter who had scented something unexpected on the wind. He leaned back in his great chair, the movement fluid and powerful, a predator at ease. "Punishment is not necessary." He waved a dismissive hand, the muscles in his bare forearm rippling. The girl was startled. "Clean this up." The command, so calm and absolute, sent a different kind of shock through the hall. The warden blinked, confused. Lyra's mouth fell open in outrage, which she quickly tried to mask. An offense against the king, especially one so public, demanded a spectacle of retribution. Mercy was a weakness, and the king of alphas was not known for weakness. Maya didn't wait for a second command. She dropped to her knees, her movements clumsy with residual terror, and began gathering the sharp pieces of the broken flagon. The wine soaked through the knees of her trousers, warm and sticky. She kept her head bowed, her white braids forming a protective curtain around her face, but she could still feel his gaze on the crown of her head. It was like a brand. A pair of booted feet stopped beside her. She didn't need to look up to know it was Borvin. "Get up," he muttered, his voice a low growl meant only for her. "Get out. Now." She scrambled to her feet, her hands full of sharp clay fragments, and practically fled from the high table, not daring to look back. The eyes of the entire hall followed her, a wave of silent judgment and burning curiosity. She was no longer an invisible omega. She was the one the king had spared. She didn't stop until she was back in the scullery, the familiar oppressive heat and the scent of lye a perverse comfort. She dumped the shards into a waste bucket and leaned against the rough stone wall, her entire body trembling. She pressed her cool, wet hands against her burning cheeks. What just happened? He had looked at her as if he knew her, as if he saw something no one else ever had. It was absurd. He was the most powerful alpha in the known territories, a creature of legend, and she was Maya, the scribbled omega. The girl sold for 30 silver. Their worlds were so far apart they should never have collided. Yet, in that single, searing moment of eye contact, they had. The memory of his face, the untamed golden hair, the brutal lines of his jaw, the sheer, overwhelming maleness of him, was seared into her mind. And his scent. When she had been close to him, it had cut through the smells of food and smoke. It was the clean, sharp scent of winter pine and cold, starlit nights, with an undercurrent of something wild and dangerous, like lightning on the wind. It was a scent that should have repelled her, that screamed of the power that could break her. Instead, a treacherous, deeply buried part of her had recognized it. The thought was so ludicrous it made her dizzy. Dreaming of the king, are we, scullery rat? Maya flinched, her heart leaping into her throat. Lyra stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression a mask of pure, undiluted hatred. Rhea and Kale flanked her, their smirks identical. "You think because he didn't have you whipped, you're special?" Lyra took a step closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You are nothing. A piece of filth he didn't deem worth the effort of crushing beneath his boot. Remember that." Maya said nothing. She kept her eyes on the floor, the old habit of submission reasserting itself. But for the first time, the submission felt thin, fragile. The king's gaze had fractured it. Lyra sneered, seeing her silence as victory. "My father has assigned you to latrine duty for the next month, and you can forget your pallet in the servants' loft. You'll sleep in the kennels with the other bitches where you belong. Now get out of my sight." She swept out, her cronies following. The kennels. It was cold, damp, and stank of wet dog and filth. It was a deliberate humiliation. That night, curled on a pile of stale straw in a dark corner of the kennel, the hounds shifting and whining around her, Maya couldn't sleep. The scalding burns on her legs throbbed in time with her heartbeat. The memory of Creed's stormy eyes played over and over behind her closed eyelids. She pulled the rough wool blanket tighter around her shoulders, shivering. The cold from the stone floor seeped up into her bones. As she lay there, a strange warmth began to bloom on her skin, a counterpoint to the chill in the air. It was a familiar, yet always ignored, sensation. The tattoos on her arms and legs, hidden beneath her sleeves and trousers, were humming, a faint, almost imperceptible vibration. Absently, she pushed up her sleeve and stared at the intricate, indigo patterns in the sliver of moonlight filtering through a crack in the wall. They seemed darker tonight, the lines more defined. She traced one of the swirling shapes on her forearm with a fingertip. It felt warm. For a fleeting, mad second, she didn't just feel the shape of the tattoo. She felt the shape wanting to change, to shift under her touch, as if it were a lump of clay waiting to be molded. She snatched her hand away, a fresh chill, this one born of fear, washing over her. It was her imagination, a trick of the moonlight and her exhausted, traumatized mind. The markings were a defect, a curse. They meant nothing, but as she finally drifted into a fitful sleep, haunted by gray eyes and the scent of winter pine, her last conscious thought was of the king's intense, probing stare. He hadn't looked at her like she was cursed. He had looked at her like she was a secret, and the terrifying, thrilling part was that for the first time in her life, she wanted to know what that secret was. The predator had seen the prey, and in doing so, had awakened something in her that had been sleeping for a very, very long time, and she had no idea if it was her salvation or her doom. The kennels were a special kind of hell. The air was thick with the musky scent of wet dog, stale straw, and the sharp tang of ammonia. The hounds, massive, shaggy-coated beasts used for hunting wolves and tracking fugitives, were restless. They paced their stone enclosures, their low whines and the clink of their chains a constant, unnerving soundtrack to the deep hours of the night. Maya curled tighter into herself on her thin pallet of straw, trying to escape the chill that radiated from the stone floor. It was a futile effort. The cold was a living thing here, seeping into her bones, a stark reminder of her place. Lyra's words echoed in her mind. The other bitch is where you belong. Sleep was a fractured, elusive thing. Every time she drifted off, the memory of Creed's stormy gray eyes would jolt her back to consciousness, her heart hammering against her ribs. That gaze had been a key, turning a lock deep inside her, and now something was rattling the door, demanding to be let out. It was a terrifying, restless energy that made her skin feel too tight. The tattoos on her arms and legs, usually just a faint, cool presence, felt different. They hummed with a low, persistent warmth, a sensation so alien she kept pushing up her sleeves to check if they were glowing. They weren't. They were just the same deep indigo patterns, but in the slivers of moonlight, they seemed to writhe, as if the lines themselves were alive. It's the stress, she told herself, the rational part of her mind fighting a losing battle. The fear. The king. His power. It's affecting me. A large hound in the adjacent pen let out a low, rumbling growl. It was staring directly at her, its eyes reflecting the moonlight like chips of amber. It wasn't a hostile stare, but a curious, intense one. It was the same way Creed had looked at her. She shoved the thought away, burying her face in the scratchy wool of her blanket. She needed to be invisible again. She needed to forget the look in the Alpha King's eyes and the strange, answering call in her blood. Dawn came, gray and miserable, seeping through the cracks in the kennel walls. Her body ached from the cold and the hard floor, and the burns on her legs from the spilled wash water were an angry, painful red. The head kennel master, a grizzled old beta named Griff, tossed a bucket of raw, bloody offal into the feeding troughs, barely glancing at her. You, Omega. The warden wants the main courtyard cleared of the celebration debris. Now, before the king and his retinue depart. Depart. The word sent a conflicting jolt through her. Relief warred with a bizarre, sharp sense of disappointment. Once he was gone, things could return to normal. Her miserable, invisible, but predictable normal. She hurried out into the crisp morning air, grateful to be free of the kennel's stench. The courtyard was a wreck. Torn banners, discarded chicken bones, and shattered mugs littered the cobblestones. The sky was a heavy, leaden gray, threatening rain. A handful of other low-ranking Omegas and elderly Betas were already at work, their heads down, their movements sluggish. Maya found a broom and began to sweep, focusing on the simple, physical task. Sweep, gather, dump. Sweep, gather, dump. It was a mantra. If she could just make it through this morning, if she could just remain unnoticed. Well, look who it is. The kennel bitch thinks she can clean. Lyra's voice was like a shard of ice down her spine. Maya didn't look up. She kept sweeping, her knuckles white on the broom handle. I'm talking to you, Scribble Skin. Lyra moved to stand directly in her path, flanked by Rhea and Kale. My father was far too lenient with you. A month in the kennels is a holiday. You embarrassed me in front of the king. I did nothing, Maya said, the words escaping before she could stop them. She immediately regretted it. Lyra's eyes widened in mock surprise, then narrowed into slits. Nothing? You exist. That is an offense. You breathed the same air as him. You met his gaze, you little wretch. She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a malicious whisper. I think you need a reminder of your place. Before Maya could react, Lyra snatched the broom from her hands and threw it aside. Then, with a cruel smile, she gestured to a large, muddy puddle left by last night's rain, thick with horse dung and rotting food. Get in, Lyra commanded. Maya stared at the filth, her stomach churning. No. Get in the puddle. Lyra's voice lost its playful malice and became hard. An alpha's daughter used to being obeyed. Or I will have Borvin hold you down in it until you drown. The other servants had stopped working, watching the scene with averted eyes. No one would help her. No one ever did. A hot, bitter rage boiled up in Maya's throat. It was the same rage she'd felt when her uncle sold her. The same rage she swallowed every day. But today, after the seismic shock of Creed's attention, it felt different. It felt sharper, closer to the surface. The strange warmth in her tattoos flared. A sudden, almost painful heat. Fight. A wild, unfamiliar voice whispered inside her. Fight back. But she was one. And they were three. She was an Omega. And Lyra was an Alpha's daughter. The reality of her powerlessness was a cage. Trembling with a mixture of fury and humiliation, Maya took a step towards the puddle. The mud squelched over her worn boots, cold and vile. She met Lyra's triumphant gaze for one last, defiant second, then looked down at the murky water, and that's when she saw it. Reflected in the filthy puddle was a figure standing on the high rampart overlooking the courtyard. Tall, broad-shouldered, a mane of golden hair tossed by the wind. Creed. He was watching. His arms were crossed over his chest, his posture relaxed, but his focus was absolute. He was witnessing her humiliation, a fresh, different kind of shame, white-hot and searing, burned through her. Not shame for being forced into the mud, but shame for her submission, for her weakness. Under the gaze of that primal, powerful male, her capitulation felt like a betrayal of something she didn't even understand. Lyra, following her gaze, looked up and saw the king. A flicker of unease crossed her face, but it was quickly replaced by a smug satisfaction. She believed his presence validated her dominance. He sees what you are now, Lyra hissed. Filth. The words were the final spark. The heat in Maya's tattoos surged. No longer a warmth, but a burning, electric current. A strange pressure built behind her eyes. And the world seemed to sharpen, the colors becoming painfully vivid. The scent of the mud, the pine from the forest, the metallic tang of the coming rain, it all flooded her senses, overwhelming her. She couldn't do it. She couldn't kneel in the filth with him watching. She took a step back, out of the puddle, Lyra's face contorted with rage. I gave you an order. Maya stood her ground, her heart pounding a wild, frantic rhythm against her ribs. She said nothing. She just stood there, mud dripping from her boots, her head held higher than it had any right to be. For a long, tense moment, they stared at each other. The entire courtyard was silent, holding its breath. Then, from high on the rampart, a sound cut through the tense silence. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a command. It was a howl, a single, long, resonant howl that seemed to tear the very fabric of the gray morning. It was a sound of pure, untamed wildness, a sound of power and dominion that made the hairs on every arm stand on end. It was Creed. The sound vibrated through Maya's entire being, a primal call that resonated with the strange energy coursing through her. It felt like an answer, like an acknowledgement. The effect on Lyra was instantaneous. All the color drained from her face. The howl wasn't a command to her, but a judgment. Alpha King had just voiced his... what? His disapproval? His interest? It was a language beyond words, and it terrified her. She took a stumbling step back from Maya, her bravado utterly shattered. She glanced once, fearfully, up at the rampart, then turned and fled into the fortress, Rhea and Kale scrambling after her. The courtyard remained frozen for a moment longer. Then, slowly, the other servants returned to their work, casting furtive, odd glances first at the now empty rampart, and then at Maya. Maya stood alone in the middle of the courtyard, mud on her boots, her body trembling not with fear, but with a shocking, exhilarating surge of power. The heat in her tattoos slowly receded, leaving behind a pleasant, humming warmth. He had seen her humiliation, and he had howled. He hadn't intervened directly. He hadn't swooped down to save her. That wasn't his way. He was a predator, and predators observed. They tested. They judged the strength of their prey. And in that moment, Maya knew with a certainty that shook her to her core that the game had changed. The predator wasn't just watching the prey anymore. He was testing her, pushing her to see if she would run or if she would fight. She looked down at her hands, at the indigo lines peeking out from under her sleeves. For the first time in her life, they didn't feel like a curse. They felt like a promise. And as the first drops of cold rain began to fall, washing the mud from the stones, Maya made a silent vow. She would not be broken. She would not kneel again. The king of alphas had howled for her, and somewhere deep inside, the lost girl who had been sold for 30 pieces of silver began to howl back. The rain fell in a steady, cold drizzle, washing the filth from the cobblestones and plastering Maya's white braids to her scalp and neck. She barely felt it. The echo of the king's howl still vibrated in her bones, a seismic event that had reshaped the very atmosphere of Greywater Fortress. The other servants gave her a wide berth as they hurried to finish their work, their glances no longer just dismissive, but tinged with a new, wary respect. She had defied Lyra, and the Alpha King had acknowledged it. No one understood what it meant, but the power of that single, primal sound was undeniable. Maya finished clearing her section of the courtyard in a daze, her movements automatic. Her mind was a whirlwind, replaying the moment Lyra's confidence had shattered, replaced by pure, unadulterated fear. She had stood her ground, and he had seen her. When the task was done, Griff the kennel master grunted at her. The warden wants the guest wing corridors scrubbed. The king's party tracked in mud from the hunt yesterday. Get to it. The guest wing, where Creed and his retinue were quartered. A fresh jolt of mingled terror and anticipation shot through her. This was a test, or a trap, or both. She collected a bucket, brushes, and rags from the supply closet, her hands trembling slightly. The long, torch-lit corridors of the guest wing were unnervingly quiet compared to the usual bustle of the fortress. The air here was different, cleaner, colder, carrying the distinct wild scent of the visiting alphas. And underneath it all, like a constant, haunting melody, was the scent of winter pine and cold starlight. His scent, it was everywhere. It clung to the tapestries, the stone walls, the very air she breathed. Each inhalation was a violation and an intoxication. It made her feel lightheaded, her senses stretching taut, hyper-aware of every shadow, every distant sound. She knelt on the cold stone floor, dunking her brush into the soapy water, and began to scrub. The rhythmic motion was supposed to be calming, but her heart refused to settle. She was scrubbing the floor he walked on. She was breathing the air he breathed. The predator had marked his temporary territory, and she was now inside its boundaries. Why did he howl? The question was a relentless drumbeat in her mind. Was it a mockery of her struggle? A signal to his own men? Or was it, as her treacherous heart whispered, a challenge? A call to see what she was made of? She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't hear the soft footfall behind her until it was too late. A shadow fell over her, vast and blocking the torchlight. The scent of winter pine intensified, flooding her senses, making the air too thick to breathe. Every nerve in her body screamed in unison. She froze, her brush stilled on the wet stone, her head bowed. She couldn't look up. She couldn't move. Look at me. The voice was low, a gravelly command that brooked no disobedience. It wasn't loud, but it vibrated through the floor and up into her knees, a physical force that demanded obedience. Slowly, every muscle protesting, Maya lifted her head. He stood over her. Creed, the Alpha King. He wasn't dressed in his formal vest, but in simple, dark leather trousers and a loose linen shirt, the laces at the throat undone. He looked more primal, more real like this. His golden hair was damp from the rain, curling wildly around his face. His stormy gray eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. This close, his power was a crushing weight. It wasn't just his size, though he was immense. It was the raw, untamed energy that radiated from him, the absolute authority in his stance. He was the apex predator, and she was on her knees at his feet. The humiliation of her position burned, but she couldn't look away. His gaze held hers, pinning her in place. You did not kneel in the mud, he said, his tone conversational, as if commenting on the weather. Maya's throat was too dry to form words. She could only manage a slight, jerky shake of her head. Why? The single word was a blade, sharp and precise. It demanded the truth. She found her voice, a hoarse whisper. I was angry. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of something interest, amusement in their stormy depths. Anger is a luxury for those with power. You have none. It was a statement of fact, delivered without malice, and it cut deeper than any of Lyra's insults ever could, because it was true. I have my pride, she whispered, the words feeling foolish and small the moment they left her lips. A slow, dangerous smile touched his mouth. It didn't reach his eyes. Pride, a fragile shield for an Omega. He took a single step closer, and she had to tilt her head back further to maintain eye contact. His scent wrapped around her, dizzying, possessive. You have markings. Her breath hitched. He wasn't looking at her face anymore. His gaze was traveling over her, lingering on her arms, even though they were covered by the long sleeves of her tunic. They are a defect, she said automatically, the words she'd heard her entire life. A curse. Are they? He murmured, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble that seemed to vibrate in her very core. He crouched down in front of her, bringing them to eye level. The movement was so fluid, so controlled. It was like watching a great cat settle. He was so close now, she could see the individual flecks of silver in his gray eyes, see the faint scar that bisected his left eyebrow. The world vanished. There was only him, this close, his overwhelming presence, his scent, his heat. The predator was no longer observing from a distance. He was in her space, examining his curious, defiant prey. Show me, he commanded, his voice soft but absolute. A tremor racked her body. No one had ever asked to see them. They had always been a source of shame, something to be hidden. To reveal them felt more intimate, more vulnerable, than standing naked before him. But his will was a force of nature. Her hands, trembling violently, went to the cuffs of her tunic. She pushed the coarse gray fabric up, first one arm, then the other, revealing the intricate indigo tattoos that coiled from her wrists to her shoulders. The air between them crackled. Creed's intense gaze swept over the markings, studying them with a hunter's focus. He didn't look disgusted. He looked fascinated. How long have you had them? He asked, his eyes still fixed on the swirling patterns. Since birth. Do they hurt? No. Do they do anything? The question was too close to the strange warmth, the humming sensation she had felt, the secret she barely dared admit to herself. No, she lied, her voice barely a whisper. His eyes lifted from her arms and locked with hers again. He knew she was lying. She could see the knowledge in his piercing gaze. He could scent the deception on her. He reached out, his movements slow, deliberate, giving her every opportunity to flinch away. She didn't. She was mesmerized. His fingertips, calloused and warm, brushed against the skin of her inner forearm, tracing one of the larger, spiral-shaped tattoos. A jolt of pure, white-hot lightning shot up her arm, exploding through her entire nervous system. It wasn't pain. It was activation. The tattoo under his touch flared with heat, and for a single, heart-stopping second, she didn't just feel the shape of it, she felt its potential. It was a living thing, a coiled spring of energy waiting for her command. She felt, with terrifying clarity, that she could change its form, make it shift from a spiral to a star, to a blade. A sharp gasp escaped her. She jerked her arm back as if burned, scrambling away from him on the wet floor, her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest. She stared at him, her pale blue eyes wide with terror and revelation. Creed didn't move. He remained crouched, his hand still hovering in the air where her arm had been. His expression was unreadable, but his stormy eyes blazed with a fierce, triumphant light. A defect, he repeated, his voice a low, possessive growl. I think not. Before she could process his words, the sound of booted feet echoed down the corridor. Two of Creed's warriors, massive men with the same wild aura, rounded the corner. They stopped short at the sight of their king crouched before a trembling Omega on the floor. My king, one of them said, his voice respectful but urgent. The scout has returned. There is news from the northern pass. It requires your attention. Creed's gaze lingered on Maya for a moment longer, a silent promise, a threat, a question. Then, in one fluid motion, he rose to his full, imposing height, turning his attention to his men. "I will be there shortly." He didn't look back at her as he strode away, his warriors falling into step behind him. The corridor felt empty without his presence, the air thin and lifeless. Maya collapsed against the cold wall, her entire body shaking. She stared at the tattoo on her forearm, the one he had touched. It still hummed with a residual, eager warmth. She could still feel the ghost of his fingertips on her skin. He knew. He knew the tattoos were more than just marks. And in that single touch, he had awakened something she could never put back to sleep. The lost girl was gone. In her place was a woman with a secret, a power she didn't understand, and the terrifying, unwavering attention of the most dangerous predator in the world. The game was indeed changing, and she was no longer just the prey. She was a player, and she had no idea what the rules were. The rest of the day passed in a blur of terrified autopilot. Maya scrubbed the corridors until her knuckles were raw and the soapy water turned ice cold, but she felt nothing. Her entire being was focused inward, on the memory of Creed's touch and the shocking, electric response of her tattoo. It was real. The thought was a chasm opening at her feet. All her life, the faint warmth, the occasional sensation of shifting under her skin, had been something she could dismiss as imagination, a trick of a mind desperate for any form of power or identity. But now, she had felt it. A latent energy, sleeping in her very cells, had been roused by the Alpha King's proximity. By his touch, she kept her sleeves pulled down, the coarse fabric a poor shield against the truth. The markings felt different now, not like inert ink, but like sleeping serpents coiled just beneath her skin, aware and waiting. When she was finally dismissed for the evening, the sky was a deep, bruised purple. The prospect of returning to the cold, stinking kennels was a fresh wave of misery, but as she trudged across the inner bailey, Griff intercepted her. "Not the kennels," he grunted, not meeting her eyes. He jerked his thumb towards the servants' quarters. "Your old pallet. Warden's orders. Lyra's doing, no doubt." A minor reprieve designed to look like mercy, but Maya knew it was fear. The king's howl and his subsequent interest had forced the warden's hand. They couldn't be seen treating her too brutally now. She was under his scrutiny, and that made her dangerous. Her pallet in the drafty, cramped loft was a luxury after the kennels. The other servant girls, a mix of betas and a few other omegas, gave her a wide berth, whispering behind their hands. The story of the courtyard and the king's howl had spread like wildfire. She was a pariah, but now she was a fascinating one. Maya ignored them. She crawled onto her thin mattress, pulling the scratchy blanket over her head, creating a dark, private cocoon. She pushed up her sleeve and stared at the tattoos in the near darkness. Tentatively, she touched the same spiral Creed had. Nothing. Just the familiar texture of her own skin. She focused, trying to summon the feeling from the corridor. She concentrated on the spiral, willing it to change, to shift, to do something. She poured all her frustration, her fear, her newfound fragile defiance into that single mark. It remained stubbornly, unmovingly, a spiral. A sob of frustration caught in her throat. Had it been a fluke? A trick of her terrified mind? Was she truly just a defective Omega, and his interest merely a predator's fleeting curiosity for a strange, broken creature? The thought was a crushing weight. She curled into a tighter ball, the hope that had begun to unfurl within her withering into ash. She was a fool, a stupid, dreaming fool. Sleep, when it finally came, was not a respite. It was a descent. She was running, not on 2 legs, but on 4. Her body a low, powerful silhouette against a moon-drenched landscape of silver grass and jagged black mountains. The wind streamed through a thick, white pelt, carrying scents so vivid they were like taste snow, pine, blood. Power thrummed in her muscles, a savage, joyous energy. She was not prey, she was the huntress. A howl ripped through the night, not from her throat, but from another. A deeper, answering call that vibrated in her very bones. A call of recognition, of possession. She turned her head and saw him. A massive wolf, his fur the color of moonlight on gold, his eyes the same stormy gray as the man. Creed, he stood on a ridge above her, a king surveying his domain, his gaze locked on her. Then, the dream shifted. The feeling of power evaporated, replaced by a child's terror. She was small again, 9 years old, the cold chain around her neck, but the man leading her wasn't the leather-clad stranger. It was Creed. He turned to look at her, his gray eyes ancient and sad. "You have been lost for a long time, little wolf," he said, his voice echoing. "It is time to come home." The chain around her neck began to glow with a fierce, blue-white light. It wasn't metal anymore. It was her own tattoos, unspooling from her skin, wrapping around her, binding her, lifting her. Maya woke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright on her pallet. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. The loft was dark, filled with the soft sounds of sleeping women. Cold sweat soaked her tunic. Little Wolf. The name echoed in her mind. A ghost from a dream that felt more real than the scratchy blanket beneath her. And the sensation of the tattoos moving, of becoming something else. It had been so vivid, shaken. She slipped out of her pallet and padded silently to the small, grimy window at the end of the loft. She needed air. She needed to see the sky. The fortress was quiet, bathed in the cool light of a 3/4 moon. As she stood there, trying to calm her racing heart, a flicker of movement in the courtyard below caught her eye. Creed. He was alone, pacing the moon-washed cobblestones like a caged animal. His movements were restless, powerful, each step echoing with a contained energy that was almost violent. He was shirtless despite the chill, his bare torso a landscape of sculpted muscle and pale scars. He stopped suddenly, his head tilting back as he looked up at the moon, his profile sharp and savage. And then, as if he could feel her gaze, his head turned slowly, and his stormy eyes lifted, finding her in the dark window. He was too far away for her to see his expression, but she felt the connection like a physical blow, a taut wire strung between them across the moonlit distance. The dream rushed back, the feeling of running on 4 legs, the name Little Wolf, the possessive look in the eyes of the golden wolf. Her breath caught. The tattoos on her arms began to hum, a low, resonant thrum that was an echo of the power she'd felt in the dream. This time, it wasn't a fluke. It was a response. To him, to the moon, to the wildness he embodied. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just stood there, watching her, a silent sentinel in the night. And in that moment, Maya knew with a certainty that stole her breath. Her dream was not just a dream. It was a memory. A truth buried so deep that only the catalyst of his presence could unearth it. She wasn't just a cursed Omega. She was something else, something he recognized. She was lost, and he, the most terrifying predator she had ever known, was the only one who seemed to know where she belonged. The morning brought no clarity, only a deeper, more tangled knot of fear and anticipation. The dream clung to Maya like a second skin, the name Little Wolf, a whisper in her mind that wouldn't fade. She moved through her chores in the laundry, a punishment reassignment from a still fuming Lyra with a distracted air, her mind replaying the image of Creed watching her in the moonlight. The other laundry women kept their distance, their usual gossip silenced in her presence. The story of the king's attention had painted a target on her back, but it had also erected an invisible wall. She was no longer one of them. The monotony of pounding wet linens against the washing stones was shattered mid-morning when Borvin strode into the steamy room, his face grim. All unbonded Omegas and lower Betas to the main yard. "Now," he barked. "The king demands a trial of blood before his departure." A collective, fearful murmur rippled through the women. A trial of blood. Maya's blood ran cold. She knew what it was. A barbaric tradition from the old times, a test to uncover hidden strength or weed out the weak. It was a brutal spectacle she'd only heard stories about. "What for?" one brave woman whispered. Borvin's gaze swept over them, lingering for a fraction of a second on Maya. "The king seeks a guide, a tracker, someone with an innate sense for the old ways. The trial will find them." He herded them out into the main courtyard, which had been transformed. A large circle had been drawn in the dirt in the center. The entire population of the fortress seemed to be gathered around it, guards, servants, nobles. On a raised dais sat Creed, flanked by his warriors and the nervous-looking warden. He looked every inch the barbarian king, his stormy gaze sweeping over the assembled crowd with detached interest. Lyra stood near the dais, preening, clearly believing herself far above such a base trial. Her eyes found Maya's, and a smirk of pure malice twisted her lips. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs. A guide? A tracker? This was no random test. This was for her. He was creating a pretext, a public reason to test her, to push her further. The dream, the howl, the touch, it was all leading to this. One of Creed's warriors, a hulking man with a shaved head, stepped into the circle. "The rules are simple," he announced. his voice carrying across the silent yard. "You will enter the circle, one at a time. You will face one of our warhounds. You cannot harm the beast. Your task is to avoid its jaws, to read its intent, to move with its energy. You must last until the horn sounds. Those who are caught, or who flee the circle, fail." A massive, brindle-colored hound was led into the circle. It was every bit as large as the ones in the kennels, but this one's eyes held a sharp, trained intelligence. It was a killer. Saliva dripped from its jowls as it scanned the crowd, its body tense and ready. The first Omega, a young girl even skinnier than Maya, was shoved into the circle. She lasted 3 seconds before the hound lunged, its teeth closing on the sleeve of her tunic and dragging her, screaming, from the circle. The warrior shook his head. Next, one by one, the unbonded were forced into the circle. Some froze in terror, others tried to run and were easily caught. A few showed fleeting glimpses of agility, dodging once or twice, but none could match the hound's speed and power for more than a handful of heartbeats. The courtyard was filled with the sounds of tearing cloth, frightened cries, and the low, excited growls of the beast. Maya watched, her stomach churning. This was a cruel, pointless spectacle. How could any of them, beaten down servants, hope to stand against a warhound? "You, the marked one." The warrior's voice cut through her thoughts. All eyes turned to her. Borvin gave her a rough shove towards the circle. Her legs felt like water. This was it. He was throwing her to the wolves, quite literally. She stumbled into the center of the dirt circle, the fine hairs on her arms standing on end. The brindle hound turned its massive head towards her, its dark eyes locking onto hers. It lowered its head, a deep, rumbling growl emanating from its chest. The world narrowed to the circle of dirt, the panting beast, and the feel of dozens upon dozens of eyes watching her. She could feel Creed's gaze most of all. A heavy, expectant weight. The hound lunged. Pure, undiluted instinct took over. Maya didn't think. She moved. She dropped into a low crouch, spinning away from the snapping jaws so closely she felt the wind of its passage. The movement was unnaturally fluid, a dancer's grace she didn't know she possessed. The crowd gasped. The hound recovered instantly, circling her, its growl deepening. It feinted left, then went for her right leg. Again, she moved, not away, but with it, her body arcing around its charge like water around a stone. Her heart was a wild thing in her chest, but a strange calm was settling over her mind. She could feel the hound's intent. She could see the slight tightening of its shoulder muscles a split second before it moved. It was like the dream. The same hyper-awareness, the same connection to a body that felt both foreign and intimately hers. The hound attacked again and again, a whirlwind of teeth and muscle. Maya weaved, ducked, and rolled, her movements becoming more confident, more instinctual. She wasn't fighting it. She was flowing with it. The tattoos on her arms and legs were blazing with heat, a map of fire under her skin, guiding her, fueling her. She could hear nothing but the hound's snarls and the blood roaring in her ears. She saw nothing but the beast's eyes, its shifting weight, the patterns of its attack. Then, something shifted. The hound paused, its head cocked. It wasn't growling anymore. It was whining. It took a hesitant step back, its tail dropping between its legs. It was looking not at her, but past her, at her arms. Maya risked a glance down. A faint, shimmering haze of blue-white light, like the ghost of frost, was emanating from the tattoos on her forearms. The intricate lines seemed to be moving, twisting just at the edge of perception. A stunned silence had fallen over the courtyard. The hound let out a final, submissive whimper and lay down in the dirt, placing its head on its paws. The horn to end the trial blared, the sound harsh and abrupt in the silence. Maya stood panting in the center of the circle, her body thrumming with spent energy and awakening power. She looked up, her pale blue eyes finding Creed's. He was on his feet. His expression was no longer one of detached interest. It was one of fierce, primal triumph. The storm in his eyes had cleared, replaced by a blazing, absolute certainty. He didn't need to speak. His look said everything. He had found what he was looking for. The silence in the courtyard was profound, broken only by the whining of the cowed warhound and Maya's own ragged breaths. The air, thick with dust and tension, felt charged, as if a lightning strike were imminent. All eyes were fixed on her, a mixture of awe, fear, and outright terror. She looked down at her arms again. The faint, shimmering light was fading, the tattoos settling back into their familiar, dormant state. But the memory of their power, The way they had guided her movements and cowed the beast was seared into her soul. It was real. All of it. "Sorcery!" a voice shrieked. Lyra. She was pointing a trembling finger at Maya, her face contorted with a venomous rage. "She's a witch!" She cursed the hound. "Father, she must be purged!" The warden looked from his daughter to the king, his face a mask of panic. This was beyond his understanding, his control. Creed ignored them both. His gaze was locked on Maya. He stepped down from the dais, his movements deliberate, powerful. The crowd parted before him like wheat before a scythe. He walked to the edge of the circle, his stormy eyes sweeping over her, from her heaving chest to her trembling hands, as if committing the sight of her, empowered and defiant, to memory. "The trial is concluded," he announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs that had begun to rise. It was not loud, but it carried absolute authority. He didn't look away from Maya. "The guide has been found," Lyra sputtered. "My king, you cannot be serious. This thing is an abomination. Her markings, they're a blight." Finally, Creed turned his head, a slow, predatory pivot that silenced Lyra instantly. The look in his eyes was not anger, but a cold, dismissive finality that was far more terrifying. "You question my judgment?" The question was a soft, deadly whisper. Lyra took a step back, paling. "No, my king, I only meant, your meaning is irrelevant." His attention returned to Maya. "The marked one is under my protection now. She is mine." The words "she is mine" echoed in the silent courtyard. They weren't spoken with passion, but with possession. A simple, unchangeable statement of fact, as if he were claiming a piece of land or a newly forged sword. A collective, sharp intake of breath swept through the crowd. Maya's own breath caught his. The word should have felt like a new chain, a different kind of slavery. But the way he said it, the fierce, protective light in his eyes, it didn't feel like ownership. It felt like belonging. The chasm of loneliness inside her, the one that had been her constant companion since she was 9, trembled. He extended a hand towards her, not in offering, but in command. "Come." It was the same voice that had told her to look at him in the corridor, the same voice that demanded truth. There was no force in it, only an expectation that she would obey, that her will would align with his because it was the natural order of things. For a heartbeat, she hesitated. This was the point of no return. To take his hand was to step out of the shadows of Greywater forever, to leave behind the only life she'd known for 15 years, miserable as it was. It was to step into the storm that was Creed, to embrace the terrifying power awakening inside her. She looked at his hand, large and calloused, capable of both brutal violence and the gentlest of touches. She remembered the dream. "Little wolf, it is time to come home." Her decision was made not in her mind, but in her blood, in the humming tattoos, in the core of her that had recognized him from the very first moment. She placed her small, work-roughened hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong, engulfing her completely. A jolt, less violent than the first but just as profound, passed through her. It was a circuit completing, a connection snapping into place. The restless energy inside her stilled, not vanishing, but settling, as if it had found its anchor. A low, approving rumble started in Creed's chest, a sound that was almost a purr. He drew her from the circle, pulling her gently to his side. She stood beside him, her shoulder brushing against his arm, his immense presence a wall between her and the staring, hostile world. "We leave for Blood Moon Citadel within the hour," he said, his voice now addressed to the warden. But his gaze still lingered on Maya's profile. "See that she is given suitable traveling clothes. And a cloak. The mountain winds are cold." He finally turned, his hand still holding hers, and began to lead her from the courtyard, his warriors falling into step behind them. The crowd stared, utterly dumbfounded. Lyra looked on, her face a grotesque mask of fury and shattered dreams. Maya walked beside him, her head high, her white braids shining in the sun. She didn't look back at Greywater Fortress, at the scullery, the kennels, or the sneering face of Lyra. She looked ahead, through the main gates, to the wild, pine-scented path that led into the mountains. The lost girl was gone. The prey had been caught, but in the catching, she had been transformed. She was Maya, the marked one, the one who had faced the warhound and won, the one the Alpha King had claimed. And as she walked hand in hand with the predator into the unknown, the first, fragile bud of a new emotion began to unfurl within her, delicate and fierce all at once. It was hope. The fortress gates closed behind them with a definitive, booming thud that sounded like the end of one life and the beginning of another. The air changed instantly. It was no longer the stagnant, contained atmosphere of gray water, heavy with oppression and mockery. Out here, it was wild, sharp with the scent of pine, damp earth, and the crisp promise of mountain snow. It was the scent of him. Creed released her hand as they reached the waiting party, his touch lingering for a fraction of a second, before he moved to confer with his lead warrior, a grim-faced man named Kale. The loss of contact was like stepping out of a warm circle of firelight into the cold. Her skin prickled with the absence. No one spoke to her. The warriors, a dozen of the most formidable alphas she had ever seen, cast her sidelong glances that were a mixture of curiosity, wariness, and grudging respect. They had seen the trial. They knew their king had not chosen a guide out of pity. A young, freckled beta boy, no older than 14, hurried over to her, clutching a bundle of dark gray fabric. "From the king, miss," he mumbled, not meeting her eyes. He thrust the bundle into her arms and scurried away. It was a cloak, not the coarse wool of a servant, but a heavy, soft garment, lined with thick, gray fur. Wolf fur. The irony was not lost on her. She swung it over her shoulders, the weight of it settling like an embrace, the fur soft against her neck. It was still imbued with the faint, clean scent of winter pine. His scent, it wrapped around her, a silent, primal claim that felt more binding than any chain. A moment later, the freckled boy returned, this time with a pair of sturdy, supple leather trousers and a thick, dark green tunic. "To change into, for the ride," he said, pointing towards a small, thick copse of trees a short distance from the party. A small courtesy, a shred of privacy she hadn't expected. Maya slipped into the trees, the rough bark a familiar texture against her palms. She changed quickly, the soft, well-made clothes feeling alien against her skin. They were practical, warm, and fit her perfectly. The thought of him knowing her size, of issuing such a specific command, sent a strange flutter through her stomach. He noticed everything. When she emerged, fastening the wolf fur cloak at her throat, Creed was already astride a massive, midnight black stallion that looked as wild and untamed as its rider. He watched her approach, his stormy gaze taking in the new clothes, the way the cloak draped around her. A flicker of approval, so slight she might have imagined it, crossed his features. He gestured to a sleek, dappled gray mare being held by one of his warriors. "You'll ride Arya. She is sure-footed and will not tolerate foolishness." Maya approached the mare cautiously. The animal eyed her, ears flicking forward. Maya didn't reach out to pat its nose. Instead, she stood still, letting the horse scent her. She remembered the warhound, the way it had submitted. She focused on projecting calm, on the strange, quiet energy that now hummed just beneath her skin. The mare blew out a soft breath and nudged her shoulder with its nose. A few of the watching warriors exchanged surprised looks. Creed's mouth quirked in what was almost a smile. He didn't offer to help her mount. It was another test. She gathered the reins, found the stirrup with her foot, and pulled herself up into the saddle with a grace that felt both new and deeply familiar. The leather creaked beneath her. She settled in, her back straight, her hands steady on the reins. "Move out," Creed commanded, his voice cutting through the mountain air. And with that, they were off, leaving Greywater Fortress and the ghost of the sold girl behind in the dust. The pace Creed set was brutal, a relentless push up into the jagged, snow-dusted peaks. The path was little more than a deer trail, winding through ancient forests and across treacherous, rocky scree. The air grew thinner and colder, each breath a cloud of frost. Maya focused on the rhythm of the ride, on the muscle and movement of the horse beneath her, on the simple act of survival. She was a competent rider. It had been one of her chores at Greywater, exercising the warden's more placid mounts, but this was different. This was a test of endurance. She was intensely aware of Creed, a dark, powerful presence always at the edge of her vision. He rode slightly ahead, his posture relaxed yet utterly in control, his body moving in perfect sync with his stallion. He was a part of this landscape, as elemental as the granite cliffs and the whispering pines. As dusk began to bleed the color from the sky, painting the high peaks in shades of rose and violet, they reached a small, sheltered clearing beside a half-frozen stream. Creed raised a fist, and the party drew to a halt. "We camp here for the night," he announced, swinging down from his saddle with effortless power. The warriors moved with a disciplined efficiency, unpacking bedrolls, starting a fire, and tending to the horses. Maya slid from Arya's back, her legs stiff and aching. She moved to help unsaddle her mare, but a warrior gently took the reins from her. "I'll see to her, my lady," he said, his tone respectful. My lady. The title was so absurd she almost laughed. She was no lady. She was… what was she now? She stood awkwardly on the periphery of the activity, the cloak pulled tight around her. She was an outsider here, too. The object of their king's fascination, a strange omega with glowing tattoos, a prize he had claimed but not yet explained. Creed was by the fire, talking in low tones with Kale. He hadn't looked at her since they'd stopped. The indifference should have been a relief, but it felt like a withdrawal, and that was somehow more unnerving. She found a fallen log a short distance from the main fire and sat, watching the flames dance and lick at the growing darkness. The cold seeped through the leather of her trousers, and she shivered, pulling the fur cloak tighter. The scent of him was everywhere, a constant, confusing presence. A shadow fell over her. She didn't need to look up to know it was him. He held out a wooden bowl filled with a thick, steaming stew and a hunk of dark bread. "Eat." She took it, her fingers brushing against his. A spark, familiar now, but no less potent. "Thank you." He didn't leave. He sat on the log beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He stared into the fire, his profile stark and beautiful in the flickering light. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken questions. The sounds of the camp, the murmur of voices, the clink of gear faded into the background. There was only the crackle of the fire, the sigh of the wind in the pines, and the thrumming awareness between them. Why? The word escaped her, barely a whisper. It was the question that had been burning inside her since the moment his eyes had first locked with hers in the great hall. Why me? Creed was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. He took a slow breath, the firelight catching the silver in his stormy eyes. "When I walked into that hall," he began, his voice a low rumble. The scent of fear and submission was a fog. "It was all the same. Then I caught your scent." He turned his head, his gaze capturing hers. It was like lightning on a frozen lake. Sharp, clean, dangerous, and underneath it, the oldest magic I have ever known. Her heart stuttered. "The tattoos." He gave a slow, single nod. "They are not a curse, Maya. They are a heritage, a legacy that was stolen from you." He looked back into the fire, his jaw tightening. "The night my father was challenged and killed, the night I became king, raiders from the northern wastes attacked our citadel. They took many things, but their greatest prize was the Alpha Queen, my mother, and her newborn daughter, my sister." The air left Maya's lungs. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. "They were never found," Creed continued, his voice grim and hollow. "The raiders vanished into the snow. My mother, her body was recovered weeks later, miles from the citadel. She had fought her way free, but succumbed to her wounds. My sister was gone, presumed dead, sold most likely for a handful of silver to some slaver who had no idea what he held." Maya's hands were trembling so violently she had to set the bowl down on the log. The world tilted. The memory of her uncle, the 30 coins, the cold chain, the markings she'd had since birth. "No," she whispered, the denial a frail, broken thing. Creed's gaze was relentless, pinning her to the spot. The lost princess of the Blood Moon Citadel was born with a skin of living ink, the mark of the first and most powerful alpha line, the mark of the frost wolf. He reached out, his fingers hovering just above the skin of her forearm, where the indigo patterns swirled. He didn't touch her, but the tattoos beneath her skin flared in response. A wave of heat that was both pleasure and pain. "You are not a defective Omega, Maya," he said, his voice dropping to a possessive, gravelly whisper that vibrated in her very soul. "You are Althea, first daughter of the Blood Moon. You are my sister." The log, the fire, the entire mountain, everything vanished into a roaring, white-hot static. The lost princess, his sister. The truth was not a key. It was a hammer, and it shattered her entire world. The world did not right itself. It spun, a dizzying carousel of firelight and shadow, the crackle of the flames morphing into the sound of shattering pottery, the scent of pine twisting into the acrid smell of her uncle's fierce sweat. 30 pieces of silver. Sister. The word was a brand, searing through the fragile, nascent hope that had begun to unfurl within her. It wasn't hope for a title or a throne, but for him, for the terrifying, magnetic pull that had felt like destiny, like the answering call of a missing part of her own soul. She had thought it was the beginning of a slow, burning romance. A predator recognizing his equal in the prey. She had felt the chemistry, the intense, physical awareness that crackled between them. She had dared to imagine, in her most secret heart, what it would be like to be the focus of that primal power, not as a subject, but as his. And now this. It was a cruel, cosmic joke. The king had not claimed a mate. He had recovered a lost asset. The howl in the courtyard hadn't been a challenge. It had been a familial summons. The touch that awakened her power hadn't been a lover's caress. It had been a brother's verification. No, she breathed again, the word a ragged tear in the fabric of the night. She wrapped her arms around herself, the luxurious wolf fur cloak suddenly feeling like a shroud. You're wrong. Creed's expression didn't soften. The fierce triumph was gone, replaced by a grim, unyielding certainty. I am not. The markings are proof enough, but it is more than that. It is in your scent, buried deep beneath the fear and servitude. It is in the way you move. It is in the power that answers my own. He leaned closer, his stormy eyes boring into hers. The moment I saw you, I knew. My wolf knew. You are my blood. My wolf knew. The words from her dream echoed little wolf. He hadn't been calling to a potential mate. He had been calling to a lost pup. A hysterical laugh bubbled in her throat, but it came out as a choked sob. She shot to her feet, the wooden bowl of stew tumbling to the forest floor, its contents spilling onto the pine needles like a sacrifice. She couldn't breathe. The walls of the forest were closing in, the trees becoming the bars of a new, gilded cage. You knew, she accused, her voice trembling with a fury born of shattered illusions. In the courtyard, in the corridor. You knew, and you said nothing. I had to be sure, he said, remaining seated, a rock of infuriating calm in the face of her tempest. I had to see the power awaken. I had to see the Frostwolf lineage manifest. It was the only way to be certain you were not just some marked Omega, but the true heir. The true heir, she repeated, the words tasting like ash. So all of it, the trial, it was just a test? To see if the broken thing you found was worth repairing? For the good of the Blood Moon line? Yes. His answer was brutally honest. There was no apology in it. He was an alpha king, and the survival and strength of his bloodline were all that mattered. Tears she had refused to shed for 15 years finally welled in her eyes, hot and scalding. They were not tears of sadness for the lost princess, but of rage for the stolen future of the woman she had just begun to become. The woman who had looked at a king and felt a wild, terrifying thrill. She turned away from him, from the fire, and stumbled towards the dark, welcoming anonymity of the trees. Althea. His voice came from behind her, a command and a reminder. My name is Maya, she screamed into the night, the raw sound tearing at her throat. It was the only thing she had left, the name given to her by the slaver who bought her, the name of the scullery maid, the name of the Omega. It was hers. She didn't get far. The grief and shock were too immense, a physical weight on her chest. She collapsed against the rough bark of a giant pine, sliding down to the cold ground, her body racked with silent, heaving sobs. The cloak, his cloak, pooled around her, its comforting scent now a torment. She heard his approach, the quiet, deliberate crunch of his boots on the forest floor. He didn't touch her. He simply stood nearby, a silent, powerful sentinel, giving her the space to break while ensuring she did not break alone. When the storm of tears had passed, leaving her hollow and numb, she spoke to the darkness, her voice raw. What happens now? Now, Creed said, his voice closer now, a low rumble in the night. You come home. You take your place as princess of the Blood Moon Citadel. You learn who you are. You learn to wield the power that is your birthright. And if I don't want it, she whispered, the defiance of faint dying ember. If I just want to be Maya? There was a long pause. The wind whispered through the high branches. That choice was taken from you the night you were stolen, he said. And for the first time, she heard a thread of something other than cold certainty in his voice. It was a deep, ancient sorrow. You can be Maya, but you cannot unbe Althea. The power is in your blood. The wolves in the mountains will answer your call. The ice will form at your fingertips. You can learn to command it, or it will consume you. He paused. I will not let it consume you. It wasn't a request. It was a vow. The protector, not the mate. The brother, not the lover. He finally moved, crouching down in front of her. In the dim light, His face was all sharp angles and shadow, his stormy eyes gleaming. He didn't try to comfort her. He offered her a truth, harsh and unvarnished. "The world you knew is gone," he said, his voice low and intense. "The girl you were is gone. Mourn her if you must. But do not cling to her ghost. It will only bring you pain." He reached out, and this time, he did touch her, his fingers gently tilting her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You are a frost wolf. Start acting like it." His touch was no longer an electric shock of discovery. It was a brand of ownership, of familial claim. It sealed her fate. He stood, leaving her there in the cold and the dark. "We ride at first light. Get some rest." Maya listened to his retreating footsteps. She leaned her head back against the tree, staring up at the sliver of moon visible through the canopy. The lost princess. Althea. The name felt foreign, a ill-fitting garment. Maya was the name of the survivor, the one who had endured the scullery, the kennels, Lyra's cruelty, the one who had looked into the eyes of a king and felt a spark of something that had felt like destiny. Now, that spark was extinguished, drowned in the cold waters of a truth more devastating than any lie. She was not his mate. She was his sister, and the happy ending she had been promised felt further away than ever. The path to the Blood Moon Citadel was no longer a road to freedom, but a march towards a gilded prison, a life of duty and power, forever standing in the shadow of the brother who saw her not as a woman, but as a reclaimed legacy. A single, freezing tear traced a path down her cheek. The Frost Wolf. She finally understood the name. It wasn't about power. It was about the desolate, eternal cold that had just settled in her heart.